Hi guys, coming to you from the middle of Egypt. I'm on a camel. I miss you guys. I'm gonna make another tutorial for you. Hope you're having a great week. Okay, so this week was mitosis, or today was mitosis and cancer. So I'm just going to briefly review some of the highlights. Hopefully this isn't anything new, but if it is, hopefully you get it from here. So remembering the checkpoints and the cell cycle. So this is the life of a cell, right? And you've often heard, I'm going to draw here, you've often heard the term interphase, right? So interphase is all of this. From here to here is interphase, and just this part is mitosis. So the cell spends the majority of its life in interphase. In fact, G1 is where it spends most of its time. This is when it's just doing its job, being a cell. Okay, and so this is where if you were looking inside the nucleus of the cell, it would have just one chromosome from mom and one chromosome from dad for each pair, right? And then during the S phase, you get the duplication of the chromosomes, right? And then during the G2 phase, it's just growing bigger so it can go through mitosis. And then obviously during mitosis, we go from the two duplicated chromosomes to back to the singles again, right? So this is just the normal life cycle of a cell. Whoa. But what I want to point out to you is we don't ever actually see chromosomes in a cell unless it's going through mitosis. So if you were to actually look in G1, what you would see in the nucleus is just a bunch of spaghetti. It wouldn't look like anything. It wouldn't look like chromosomes. Same thing here. In this nucleus, even though they're duplicated, you would still just see a bunch of spaghetti. It isn't until prophase of mitosis that you see chromosomes, right? Because most of the time it's just doing its job as a cell, making genes, doing all that it needs to do. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to make sure you talked about is the checkpoints. So the checkpoints are checking for damage to the DNA. Was the DNA replicated correctly? Is it ready to pull apart like it should? But what happens if it's damaged? So like let's say you've been out sunbathing and you damage your cells because the UV rays cause mutations in the DNA. So there's three options if you fail the G1 checkpoint. Option 1 is to repair. So sometimes our DNA repair mechanisms can do the job. Option 2 is to retire. So sometimes the DNA is damaged, but not in areas that the cell needs to function, for instance. And so the cell can continue to function, but it probably shouldn't go through mitosis. And so we call it retirement or G0. That's how you say that. Some cells will enter retirement early in your life and never come back out. So that's permanent retirement, like your brain cells, for instance, right? They never go through mitosis again, or your muscle cells. And so retirement, G0, is a permanent thing usually, but it doesn't necessarily lead to the death of the cell. But if the damage is too severe for the cell to repair or to retire, it will go through cell suicide, which we call apoptosis. Okay, and this is where it will purposely poke holes in itself and kill itself for the benefit of you so that it doesn't cause any kind of problems. And you've probably all experienced this at one point in your life when you got so much sun damage that the cells decided to peel. You peeled. That's massive cell suicide. That's what peeling is. And so that's what's happening with those checkpoints. The only other things I wanted to make sure you remembered is that the cell cycle is tightly controlled, right? Because if you have too much cell growth, you end up with cancer. And so the control mechanisms, we have lots of these genes, not just one. Okay, there's a whole redundancy of them. The tumor suppressors are an off switch and they are recessive. So think about lights. If you had two switches that are turned on and you wanted the room to be totally dark, you'd have to flip both of them off to get it dark. So you'd have to get two mutations in the tumor suppressors. You'd have to be homozygous for the mutation in order to cause any effect. Whereas the proto-oncogenes are an on switch. So if you think about a dark room, it would only take one flip of a switch to turn it on. And so the proto-oncogenes are a dominant mutation. If you even just get one that's overactivated, like cyclin, you'll end up with an overactivation of the mitotic pathway, too much mitosis, too many cells. The other things that help control it are contact inhibition. Cells don't tend to like to be crowded. Anchorage dependence, they don't like to do mitosis while they're floating through the bloodstream. They like to be attached to a surface. And then our telomeres, the ends of the chromosomes that get smaller every time we do mitosis. And so there's a limited lifespan. This is what causes you to die of old age. If you die of old age, it's because your telomeres became too short, that your cells couldn't go through mitosis to repair themselves, and then you just break down and you end up dying that way. And we'll talk more about that when we get into DNA replication. We'll talk about how telomeres work. And then you should have talked about cancer and the ways that we treat it. So because we have multiple proto-oncogenes and multiple tumor suppressors, cancer is an accumulation of mutations. So it usually isn't one dumb act that will cause cancer. It's like repeated dumb acts on the same tissue over and over again that will then end up with a tumor. And then it can go malignant where it spreads outside of the original tissue type it was in. And so the ways that we treat them are slash, which is surgery, cut it out; burn, which is basically shooting it with radioactive beams that will cause enough DNA damage that the cells go through apoptosis or cell suicide. And then poison is chemotherapy. So chemotherapy, it targets actively dividing cells. And since cancer cells are often going through mitosis more often than other cells, they tend to die. But any cell going through mitosis is going to die from the poison. So your skin cells, your hair follicles, your immune system, they all die as well, your intestinal lining. And so really a lot of times with chemotherapy, it's a race to see how quickly we can get the tumor to die before we accidentally kill you. A lot of people die of chemotherapy. So not great, but we're getting new techniques all the time, getting better and better. And then the only one I wanted to point out that was just kind of a gee whiz you really should know is the number one cancer for both men and women is lung cancer as far as deaths go. And obviously cigarette smoking is by far the most important risk factor, but for those of us who are Latter-day Saints who don't smoke, your number one risk factor for lung cancer is radon. And radon is in soil in certain areas of the country. Utah happens to be sitting on a huge radon deposit, and it leaches up through the soil into your homes. So you can buy a radon detector at like Harbor Freight for really cheap and put it in your homes and measure the radon. And if you have significant radon, I had significant radon in my home, you can do radon abatement. You put in a fan that pulls it out. So something you should be aware of. I have a relative that her whole job is to go around Utah educating people about radon because Utah sits on such a large deposit. So if you're living in an apartment, you ought to go get a little test kit from Harbor Freight and test your air, and then demand that your landlord get rid of it if it's bad. Anyway, so that's cell cycle and cancer. Mitosis, you should know the difference between mitosis and meiosis. That mitosis is for growing and developing and repairing, whereas meiosis is only for reproduction, right? And you did a little table in your guide, I think, on comparisons. I think that's it. Just remember that next class, Friday, is an exam review. So you're just going through the learning outcomes for this unit and then starting the test. The test starts on Friday. So on Friday, it will just be TAs in the classroom to help you review for the test. And then I will be back on Monday. I miss you all. I miss teaching. I will see you soon.